And so a couple of words about Alberto. If you don't know him, he's lovely. So Dr. Arenas grew up in Bogota, Colombia, and he is the editor-in-chief of the Journal for Environmental Education, which, as many of you know, is one of our oldest and most flagship journals. He is a professor of environmental and sustainability education in the teaching, learning, and sociocultural studies in the College of Education at the University of Arizona. He specializes in the connections between pedagogy and environmental sustainability, experiential education with an emphasis on vocational education, and the decolonization of education with the focus on restoring culturally rich, non-commodified knowledge and skills. So Dr. Arenas has also led several key projects in our field, including serving as the co-director of the study of the United States Institute, a federally funded grant that invited Indigenous Latin American college students to the University of Arizona. And between 2013 and 15, Professor Arenas was a member of the scientific committees of the World Environmental Education Conference held in Morocco and Sweden. In 2014, he was a Fulbright Scholar in Mexico, and from 17 to 21, he was an associate editor of the Environmental and Sustainability Education of Oxford Encyclopedia of Educational Administration. So quite experienced, lots to share with us, and we are so excited to welcome Dr. Arenas.
Well, good morning, everybody. This is quite a treat, really quite a treat. And thank you so much to Catherine Stevenson, to Scott Morrison for inviting me. I'm extremely appreciative of that invitation. Also to all of you for coming. I'm one of the locals here. I teach at the University of Arizona. I have been here for about 20 years. As Catherine was mentioning, I'm originally from the highlands of the Colombian Andes, but I have made it my home here in the Sonoran Desert for over 2 decades. So this is a place that I am extremely fond of, I'm extremely proud of, and there's a sense of connection, a sense of continuity with the fact that these are the original homelands of the Tohono O'odham and the Yaqui peoples who have inhabited these lands and have taken care of it for us to enjoy and to live in. Today, I want to share with you some thoughts that probably a lot of you have already considered. So hopefully I will be complementing those ideas that you already have about capitalism. I think, let me find her here. Catherine, do you know there's light here in this podium? Let me see here. Nope, it's okay.
Will that work? Maybe.
Yeah, that would help.
Shoot. Does that help at all?
Yeah, that's good enough. That's good enough. Thank you. Thank you. So for the title of my presentation, I actually shamelessly borrowed from a book called What Every Environmentalist Needs to Know About Capitalism. It's a book that was published by written by Fred Magdoff and John Bellamy Foster. And it's based on the premise that if we do not understand, if we don't have sort of a basis in economic reality, we're missing out big in what's going on as an environmentalist, but even more so as an environmentalist educators. If we go back to the work of schooling in capitalist America from the 1970s, it sort of laid the groundwork of a lot of the social understandings that needed to take place at the time. But since the 1970s onwards, we have become more aware and more conscious of the environmental problems that are affecting us today, regardless of what part of the planet we are in. And so I'm going to, in this presentation, I'm going to try to make those connections between what's going on and how perhaps as environmental educators, we could be a little bit more proactive in trying to make those connections ourselves. Obviously, environmental problems did not start with capitalism. They have existed since time immemorial. Here is one illustration of that with the Epic of Gilgamesh. Some of you may be familiar with it. When Gilgamesh, who was the handsome ruler of the city-state of Uruk in Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq, he was entrusted with the idea that he needed to be immortal. And as such, one of the ways of reaching that immortality was by cutting down the magical cedar forests, which present-day historians have identified as being that in the cedar forest of Lebanon. And in Lebanon today, there's a patch of about 17 square miles, 17 square kilometers actually, of cedars. They are still remaining. They're still intact and have been preserved by UNESCO as one of the material places for us to visit. But in that action of trying to become immortal, and he actually had one of the rare qualities at the time of being literate. And he was able to read and write in Akkadian, it is believed. But in that action of cutting down the cedar forest, the magical cedar forest, what ended up happening was that widespread erosion and extreme drought took place of that region of the world. So this is just one example of many that have occurred before and since. So capitalism is just one more element that have, in some cases, caused some of the environmental destruction, as in the case of anthropogenic climate change, but in others has greatly exacerbated some of the problems that we have faced today. When I talk about capitalism, I'm more talking about corporate capitalism, although I think capitalism in general, and perhaps we'll be able to talk in the next few days about some of the implications of it. But I want to touch on three aspects of it, which has to do with speed, the extent, and the complexities. In terms of speed, we're seeing how fast the changes are taking place. It's not just a matter of millennia, as has happened in the past, but rather in a matter of years, or even in a matter of months, that species are disappearing. In terms of the extent, we're talking not just concentrated in one single ecosystem, as in the case of Gilgamesh and the Levant, but we're talking changes that are occurring at a planetary level. And the third one has to do with complexities, in which, just take the example of industrial agriculture and genetically modified organisms. It is not my position for this presentation to take a position either or, but rather to show how different it is from the way it has been done in the past since the dawn of agriculture 10,000 years ago or so, in which farmers engaged in selective breeding of the most appropriate characteristics for both animals and flora. But that type of change, that type of selective breeding is qualitatively different from the type that has been occurring now, at least since 1994, when the first commercially available crops of BT tomatoes and then corn became available for farmers to purchase. So I just want to highlight how what capitalism has brought to us is qualitatively different than what has existed in the past. I want to offer three examples, three very simple examples that us as environmental educators have engaged in. So please raise your hand if you have ever planted a tree. So this is obviously a group of environmental educators. Thank you for raising your hand. Now raise your hand if you have taught somebody how to plant a tree. So still a large portion of all of you. And it's something that we all do. We in environmental education, we promote, we engage, we want people to do it. And it's good, and I have taught my kids to do it. I teach it in my classes here at the university. But when we start to look at the number of trees that are planted versus the number of trees that are actually cut down, we'll see a big difference. So annually, about 1.9 billion trees are planted in the world. This according to the UN and a few other sources. These are numbers that are hard to pinpoint exactly, but I think this is a good estimated guess, 1.9 billion trees. Raise your hand if you think that the number is smaller for those that are cut down, about the same, or larger. Raise your hand if you think they're larger. Yeah, exactly. You would guess that, in fact, it's about between 3.5 billion and 7 billion trees that are cut down every year in the planet. So whatever we do, we need to keep in mind that while our efforts are modest, they are important, but still need to be put in the context of what is happening in the larger sphere of things. And why is this deforestation occurring? Here I've chosen the one in the Amazon rainforest, and the reason I chose this one in particular is because most of the deforestation in the world is occurring in tropical rainforests. In fact, it's as high as 90% of all the trees that are being cut down is occurring in tropical rainforests, and most of it is occurring between two countries, Brazil and Indonesia. So let's take the case for the Amazon rainforest. Most of it actually has to do with cattle ranching and clearing the land for cattle, but also for soybean production or other sort of cash crops that can be used for cattle itself. So most of the soy that is produced in the world today actually goes to feed cattle. Then there are a few other logging and making of toilet paper and the like. But when you look at the percentages that have to do with cattle raising and cash crops that are meant for cattle themselves, then we start to see the distortion of the picture. And the picture becomes distorted because the companies behind it, in fact, when you look at the number of companies that are involved, we're really talking about just a handful, just a few of the companies that are really behind the greatest deforestation in the world. And that in turn is tied to the companies that end up buying the products that eventually are used for human consumption. So that's one of the points that when we are in the action of planting a tree, we should be talking to our students about the wider implications of what it means to do this in the here and the now versus what is happening elsewhere in the world. The second example that I want to share with you, and that we all do, is conserving water. This is probably one graph, this one or similar to this one, that we have all used in our classes. How inside the home we're supposed to use less water when we shower and turn off the faucet when we're brushing our teeth and fixing leaky faucets and the like. All that is fine and good, and we should keep on doing it. But it's fascinating once we start to look at the percentage of all the fresh water that humans use in the world, how much is actually used by municipalities. As you can imagine from the tone of this presentation, it's actually a very small percentage. Only about 10% of all the water that is used in the world actually is used by us. It's used by homes, it's used by hospitals, it's used by universities, schools, and so on. Most of it is actually used in agriculture. So let me show you here. This is a graph from 2020. And it goes to show that agriculture actually uses 70% of all the fresh water that we're using today. Industry, over 20%, and then municipalities is actually 10% or lower. For the US, it's about 6%. So it varies from country to country, but globally, this stays about true, that 70% uses water for agriculture. And that water is actually used for, again, cattle production, to produce enough forage so that it can be used by our cattle. If we step it up in the food chain, then we start to see how distorted the picture is. Because I think that ultimately capitalism has distorted the ecological processes on which we depend. So if you take, for instance, beef, about over 80% of the beef that is grown, that is raised in the world, is actually in factory farms. Most of it is in CAFOs, concentrated agricultural feeding operations, or they can be or their industrial equivalents. So what we're seeing is actually that we're taking commodification of sentient beings to a very high degree. And again, we have very few companies that are behind this extreme commodification. That happens with cattle, it happens with porcines, it happens with aviary, and so on. So it happens with all the animals that we consume on a daily basis. The third example that I want to offer to you is that of recycling plastic. We all do it, we should keep on doing it, but again, here, the number is very small. We're talking about less than 10% of all the plastic that has been produced, especially when it became widely available from the 1950s onwards. Less than 10% has actually been recycled. And so the question is why? Why does this happen? Well, it happens because it's not profitable for it to be recycled. It's extremely difficult for you to take the various types of plastics, and there are more and more being produced, and ultimately try to recycle them. So it's cheaper under the capitalist economic system to make plastic from natural gas and oil than it is to recycle plastic. In fact, the largest, there are only about 20 companies in the world today that produce over 55% of the plastics. And then there are also a few number of the very large corporations in the world that are buying that plastic. And eventually, they all make the case that we are doing our best to recycle and to be good for the planet. But the numbers, unfortunately, belie that sort of publicity, that they're trying to show themselves as good green stewards of the earth. What is it that I'm proposing as an alternative? I think there are lots of alternatives. One of them has been rising up to the fore, and I think there's a lot to be said about that, is what some scholars are calling the degrowth pedagogy. And it's the idea that we need to shrink some areas of the economy, we need to increase other areas of the economy. In a way, it's a little bit awkward when André Gorz, the Austrian-French philosopher, coined the term in the 1980s. In many ways, he himself felt that it was an awkward term to use. But nonetheless, I think it speaks directly to the unlimited growth, the unlimited profit, and the unlimited commodification that are integral to our capitalist economic system. But the idea is that we need to start shrinking rather than growing, So when I say shrinking, perhaps in some areas like part of the military-industrial complex, and growing in areas like preventive healthcare, or some other forms of growth that brings us together and that take better care of the earth. So there's a simultaneous shrinking and a simultaneous growing in areas that need to be identified, and that we as environmental educators can help in that identification and engaging our students in ways to think closer to these terms. So that is it for my presentation of right now. And if time permits, I would love to open it up for questions or comments. There's a question over there, or a comment. Not at all. We'll bring the audience to the podium. That's even better. Actually, this works quite well, so please join us. And if you could state your name, please.
My name's Karina Garbisi, and I'm from Cal State East Bay. First, thank you very much for your work and for your talk. I appreciate it. I actually just wanted to share a wonderful resource we found last year, because we wanted to teach these principles to children as young as in middle school, and be able to outline the roles of capitalism and the social justice issues in this bigger picture. Naomi Klein came out with a book in 2021. That's the children's version of This Changes Everything, and it's called How to Change Everything, and it's marvelous.
Super.
Yeah.
And how can we get that resource?
Look online. Naomi Klein is, or
your research, the work that you do.
how can you get it?
How
Can you find it?
More?
We're working on an NSF project called the Climate Empowerment Learning Initiative with kids in middle school and high school. So you can find it on the NSF abstracts.
Super.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? And sorry, you'll have to come up here. It will be easier so that you can really project your voice. Please.
So thanks again for the wonderful presentation. And I'm Julia from Taiwan. I am now studying in university, and I totally agree with you saying that we should shrink some huge economies and maybe put our well-being up ahead of the profit. However, because in high school, I do some plastic reduction, and I find that just all companies put profit ahead of everything. So is there any suggestions that you think maybe we can shrink companies, aside of making them to shrink themselves? And so I personally think that that might be a little bit impossible. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. Oh, what a wonderful contribution, thank you. You're welcome to stay here, or you're welcome to go down as you wish. Yeah, in a way the question is getting to how realistic is this proposal? How realistic it is to come up with alternatives to capitalism. One of the amazing aspects of capitalism is how efficient, how adaptive, how resilient it is to such a degree that it prevents other economic systems or other ways of thinking of how we can relate to one another and to nature. Carl Polanyi in 1944 published The Great Transformation, which is really a phenomenal book in which he tries to understand the role of markets and how he analyzed how throughout history markets, or rather market societies, I should say, market societies as opposed to markets, have actually existed for only a very short time of our history. Throughout history, most of the way we humans were able to meet our basic needs was basically through redistribution, household economies, and reciprocity. And those three mechanisms, for the most part, enabled human societies to meet their basic needs. So I think we can come up with alternatives. So going specifically to the question of how can we force or encourage or cajole corporations to do differently, things are happening. We as consumers do have a role to play. I think it's a false dichotomy to believe that it's either or. I think we as consumers do have a role to play. We can vote with our pockets. And that is happening. All of us probably are doing it in this room and elsewhere. Legislation needs to occur. We need to force companies to start going back to things like ensuring that they accept whatever they produce out, that a circular economy needs to be brought into place so that there's no waste left out. I think even in a capitalist economy, a circular economy is possible as a way of producing and consuming that will eventually ensure that no waste is generated, or that at the very least minimizes a great deal of waste. I think too that we in our own trenches need to come up with alternatives to what makes sense. The degrowth movement has a space to play. Recently, I was listening to the Minister of Mining in Colombia. They have a new leftist government in Colombia, and she was talking about degrowth. It was the first time that a minister of mining was actually talking about it. So I think there are lots of alternatives out there that are in place today. The whole cooperative movement that exists in many parts of the world is also an element of that new sort of solutions to this larger situation that we find ourselves in. Other questions or comments?
I think we can do this.
Now you don't have to come up here. You'll be able to find a
Well,
mic.
this side of the room can. We're having some issues with the connectivity, so we'll come to you next and let you go to the podium if that's okay. But we've got Ren right here.
Please, please join us in the podium. And if you could say your name and where you're coming from, please.
Arjen Wals from the Netherlands. I'm thinking about making the link with our own work as environmental education researchers and being in academia, where I see the same kind of growth narrative. We also must produce, we must publish more papers, we must get good scores, we must do well in the ranking. So this whole growth narrative is deeply entrenched in our everyday lives. Even personal growth has become a commodity. We can follow all kinds of courses, we can work on ourselves, we must grow all the time. And if we don't, if we just want to be, then we're not really participating in a way in the current. So while you're critiquing the kind of the economic growth, we also need to think, I think, about to what extent are we not a part of that same system in the way we work and the way we produce, and how do we change that in our own systems where we work in our everyday lives.
Yeah, Arjun is one of our, I'm a deep admirer of Arjun's work and the way he has influenced the work of many environmental educators around the world. So thank you for those comments and thank you for your work, Arjun. I think, I think we need to start with the personal. So I'll just tell you about my own example in my own life. When we first moved to Tucson with my wife, and we have 2 boys, 2 teenagers, we decided that it was important for us to live as simply as possible, to have as few resources as possible, to be as frugal as possible, despite the fact that we had the economic means to get more and buy a bigger house and have more cars and the like. But we said no, we do not want to be part of that idea of consuming more, of having more of that growth. When you take that from the personal and move it to the political, then I think it's incumbent on all of us to, first of all, try to consciously refrain from just partaking of that, of that sort of rat race of Arjun was saying, of publishing more. We in academia feel it all the time, of being participating in more and more projects. So we need to consciously reject that and put our foot down, and there are going to be consequences to that, professional consequences and sometimes even personal consequences. So when you take it to the political level, I think it's incumbent on all of us also to join social movements. Mark Fisher, the British philosopher who wrote Realist Capitalism, I think he hit it right in the nail when he said, we're fooling ourselves when we believe that we individually, we as consumers can make the change. It's part of it, and that's when I say I reject the 5 dichotomy, that it's not just that consumers do not play a role. I do think that consumers play a role. But it has to be consumers in the role of being part of larger social and political movements. That's what will make the change. So it ultimately, it will be inconsequential or even irrelevant for us as individuals to do our thing if we are not part of this larger movement. And the answer is going to come in very different ways for different regions around the world. But hopefully places like these in which we can share ideas and become active in trying to transform what's going on is sort of the first steps in the right direction. Other comments or questions?
Alberto, I think we have one back here.
Thank you.
Hi. Whoa, that is very loud. Hi, I'm Kathy and Khalil from the New England Aquarium. And I'm thinking about the intersection of feminism and capitalism. And this dovetails really nicely, I think, on what you're talking about. Because it's really hard. No. Yes, okay, great. It's really hard to tell people to live with less, right? That it goes against a lot of what we've been trained to do for a long time. I'm thinking about this fact that feminism speaks to a collective community, it speaks to egalitarian rights, it speaks to autonomy over your body and over your future, etc. And so I wonder if you could speak to, or we could all think about, there might be a interesting kind of workaround for a lot of these issues that might be otherwise hard to communicate, particularly as feminism is on the rise, I think, right now again. That was a comment question, I apologize.
No, it's a great comment. Yeah, I'm trying to think of something smart to say, but nothing comes to mind. I wonder if other folks would like to comment on that. Yeah, I see some hands are raised over there. Please wait for the microphone so that we can all hear you well.
Testing? Awesome. Okay. Thanks, Kathy. And I had the same thought. And what came to mind for me was thinking about examples like the Montreal Protocol, where we are seeing partnerships between governments, nonprofits, corporations, and really creating that bridge for larger industrialized nations to step down while having countries kind of who need to grow step up. And so I think that's a really interesting example to utilize as we think about that intersection, and an example that has happened and has worked. So maybe you could respond to that, or someone else could who has more knowledge, but I think that's a hopeful example we can start from.
Yeah, great example.
Awesome. I think we have time for one more question, comment.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I'm following you, I'm with you, and I just want to point out a couple of things that you have said that are slightly underneath and bring them to the surface, because I think an elephant in the room is the politics of this.
Yeah.
And you've mentioned legislation is key, and you've talked about policy, and you've talked about governments. And we've been a field that's tried to be apolitical for a very long time, and I don't think it's been helpful. And so I think that we really need to talk about what we can do now in this political state when we're seeing democracy really fragile, how we're going to tackle that, and how we can actually make the changes that we need to make at the legislative level. I don't know that we can remain apolitical.
Yeah.
So I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that would be a great way of ending my presentation. For those of you who are new or have never been to Arizona, up until the 1990s, in the state of Arizona, we had a robust environmental education movement, incredibly strong. It was supported by, at the time, we had forward-thinking politicians who did lots of wonderful things. Unfortunately, then the legislature was taken over by the Republican Party in the mid-1990s. And since then, they have depoliticized education in general and environmental education in particular. And since then, we have been trying to catch up and trying to re-energize or repoliticize environmental education, sometimes not with a great deal of success. So your comment is certainly welcome. I think we need to have a new political leadership to be able to realize that certainly environmental education, but education in general, is political. I mean, going back to the work of Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator, without that realization, we are missing out on the larger picture of what's going on. And our work becomes harmless. And that's incredibly dangerous. When the work that we all do is at the forefront of social, environmental, political, cultural change, when our work is rendered harmless, we are doing a great disservice for our profession. So think of it in those terms see yourselves as political beings who understand that the change will have to take place both individually and collectively in order to truly make a change. Thank you so much.
Okay, please join me again in thanking Alberto for a really wonderful talk. So thanks to you again for providing sort of a context for us to help think about and sort of launch us into these really big issues that hopefully we'll be able to make some real progress on in these next few days.